The RTE television studio in Dublin felt different that October evening in 2023. The Late Late Show, Ireland's longest-running and most-watched talk programme, had been on the air for over 60 years. It had hosted presidents, rock stars, activists and athletes. But the atmosphere tonight carried a particular weight, a tension that everyone in the building could feel. Two Irish icons were about to sit across from each other, and anyone who understood Irish culture knew this wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. On one side of the desk sat Roy Keane, 52 years old, former Manchester United captain, Cork native, and arguably the most respected and feared figure in Irish football history. A man whose playing career had been defined by an uncompromising will to win, by brutal honesty, and by a refusal to accept mediocrity from anyone, including himself. Since retirement, he had become one of the most outspoken pundits on British and Irish television, known for eviscerating players, managers, and anyone else he felt wasn't living up to the standards the game demanded. His opinions were delivered with a Cork accent that somehow made everything sound more cutting, more final, more like a verdict than a viewpoint. Across from him sat Conor McGregor, 35 years old, from Crumlin in Dublin, former two-division UFC champion, global superstar, businessman, and the most financially successful Irish athlete in history. Where Keane represented traditional Irish sporting values, discipline, team ethic, humility and victory, McGregor represented something newer, brasher, more American. He was loud where Keane was quiet, flashy where Keane was understated, individual where Keane was collective, and for years Keane had made no secret of his feelings about McGregor. In newspaper columns, in television interviews, in podcast appearances, Keane had repeatedly suggested that McGregor was all talk, that he represented everything wrong with modern sports, that he had no respect for what it meant to represent Ireland. Tonight, for the first time, they would address it face to face. The host, Patrick Keelty, a comedian and broadcaster from Northern Ireland, sat between them, fully aware that his job was less to ask questions and more to keep things from completely exploding. The audience, over 200 people packed into the studio, was silent with anticipation. This wasn't entertainment, this was personal. The first 15 minutes proceeded carefully. Keelty asked about their respective careers, about what drove them, about how they handled pressure. Keane spoke in his typical manner, short sentences, no wasted words, everything delivered with absolute certainty. He talked about his time at Manchester United, about playing under Alex Ferguson, about the mentality required to compete at the highest level week after week, year after year. He spoke about sacrifice, about putting the team first, about understanding that your responsibility as a professional athlete goes beyond yourself. McGregor listened, posture relaxed, legs crossed, one arm draped over the back of the chair. He spoke when asked, telling stories from his fighting career, about coming from nothing in Crumlin, about being on social welfare while training full-time, about believing in himself when nobody else did. He was articulate, funny, engaging, but there was a tension underneath everything, a sense that both men were circling each other, waiting for the real conversation to begin. It came 20 minutes in. Patrick Keelty, perhaps sensing that the audience was waiting for it, perhaps unable to resist, asked the question. "Roy, you've been quite critical of Conor over the years. Now that you're both here, do you want to explain why?"
Keane didn't hesitate. He turned slightly in his chair to face McGregor directly, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "It's nothing personal," he said, his Cork accent thick and unmistakable. "I just think there's a difference between being a champion and acting like one. And from what I've seen, Conor does a lot of talking, a lot of showing off, a lot of flashy stuff on social media. But when I look at what he represents, I don't see the values I associate with Irish sport. I see someone who's more interested in being famous than being great." The studio went quiet. McGregor's expression didn't change, but everyone could see his jaw tighten slightly. Keane continued, his tone matter-of-fact, almost clinical. When I played, we represented our clubs, our countries with dignity. We didn't go around shouting about how rich we were, how many cars we owned, how great we thought we were. We let our performances speak for us. And if we lost, we took it on the chin. We didn't make excuses. We didn't blame anyone else. We looked in the mirror and we demanded better from ourselves. He paused, then added, I don't see that in Conor. I see a lot of noise, but I don't see substance. The audience was completely still. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Patrick Keelty looked like he wanted to intervene but couldn't find the right moment. McGregor sat completely motionless for several seconds, his eyes locked on Keane. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, placed both hands on the armrests of his chair, and spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that everyone recognized. Roy, he said, I've heard you say this kind of thing about me before, in papers, on telly, everywhere, and I've never responded, because honestly, I didn't think it mattered what you thought. But since we're here now, in front of all these people, let me tell you something. You talk about dignity, you talk about representing Ireland properly, but let me ask you this. When you walked out on Ireland before the 2002 World Cup, where was the dignity in that? The room gasped. That moment when Keane had left Ireland's training camp in Saipan after a public confrontation with manager Mick McCarthy was still the most controversial incident in Irish sporting history over 20 years later. It was a wound that had never fully healed, a topic that still divided the country, and McGregor had just opened it up again, live on national television. Keane's face hardened immediately. That's completely different, he said, his voice rising slightly. I left because the preparation wasn't good enough, because the facilities weren't good enough, because I wasn't going to compromise on standards. McGregor didn't back down. He leaned further forward, his intensity increasing. You left because you couldn't control your temper, Roy. You left because when someone questioned you, you couldn't handle it, and you cost Ireland a real chance at that World Cup, a proper chance. So don't sit there and lecture me about what it means to represent this country when you abandoned them when they needed you most. The studio erupted in murmurs. Some people were nodding, others looked shocked. Keane's face had gone red, but before he could respond, McGregor kept going, his voice now louder, more forceful. You talk about substance. Let me tell you about substance. I came from nothing, Roy. Absolutely nothing. You came from Cork, from a working family. I respect that. But by the time you were 17, you were signed to a professional club. You had a path, you had a structure, you had coaches, you had scouts, you had people investing in your future. I had none of that. I was 23 years old, still on the dole, training in a gym that was falling apart, with no sponsors, no support, nothing. And I built myself into the biggest combat sports star on the planet, not with a team behind me, not with a club paying my wages, with my own 2 hands, my own belief and my own work ethic.
The audience was transfixed. Keane tried to interrupt, but McGregor raised his hand. I'm not finished, he said firmly. You say I talk too much. Maybe I do, but I'll tell you why I talk. Because where I come from, in Crumlin, nobody was going to give me anything. Nobody was going to hand me a contract. Nobody was going to believe in me unless I made them believe. So I learned to sell myself. I learned to promote myself. I learned to create opportunities where none existed. That's not disrespecting Ireland, Roy. That's surviving. That's adapting. That's doing what you have to do when the system isn't built for you. Keane's expression was difficult to read now, somewhere between anger and something else, perhaps recognition. McGregor wasn't finished. And you know what the difference between me and you is, Roy? When I lost, and I have lost, I came back. I didn't retire. I didn't walk away. I didn't write columns from the safety of a TV studio. I got back in that cage, in front of millions of people, and I fought again. Because that's what champions do.
They don't quit when things get hard. They don't abandon their team when the facilities aren't 5-star. They find a way. They endure. They prove everyone wrong. The silence in the studio was absolute. Patrick Keelty sat frozen, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. Keane stared at McGregor, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. Then slowly he spoke, his voice quieter now but still firm. "You're right about Saipan. I've thought about that decision every day for 20 years, but I stand by it. I stand by demanding the best." McGregor nodded slowly. "And I respect that, Roy. I do. But don't demand it from me and then criticize me when I deliver it in a way that doesn't fit your idea of how it should look. I've brought more attention to Irish sport than anyone in a generation. I've made kids in Dublin, in Cork, in Galway believe they can achieve anything. I've put Ireland on the global map in a way that football never did, and I did it my way. Not your way, my way." Keane's face softened, just slightly. There was a long pause, then he nodded just once, almost imperceptibly. "Fair enough," he said quietly. The audience didn't know how to react. A few started clapping, then more joined, until the entire studio was applauding. Not because either Nan had won, but because something real had just happened, something honest, something rare. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but the tone had changed completely. Keane and McGregor spoke to each other with a new kind of respect, still direct, still challenging, but without the underlying hostility. They found common ground in their working-class backgrounds, in their refusal to accept mediocrity, in their understanding that greatness requires sacrifice. By the end they were almost friendly, or at least as friendly as two proud Irish men could be after publicly confronting each other on national television. When the show ended and the cameras turned off, several people who were present said that Keane and McGregor stood and shook hands properly, not the performative television handshake, but a real one. They spoke privately for a few minutes before leaving separately. Neither of them disclosed what was said, but those who saw it described it as a moment of mutual acknowledgement. Two men who had finally said what needed to be said and could now move forward. The response across Ireland was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, clips of the exchange had been viewed millions of times. Irish newspapers led with it the next morning. Radio shows devoted entire programmes to analysing it. Social media was flooded with opinions, and for once they were divided not along typical lines, but along generational and cultural ones. Older Irish people, particularly those who had followed Keane's career, tended to sympathise with his position, valuing his emphasis on humility and team ethic. Younger Irish people, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, rallied behind McGregor, seeing in him someone who had refused to be limited by traditional expectations, who had carved out his own path in a world that wasn't designed to accommodate people like him. But the most interesting responses came from those who recognised that both men were right, that Keane's values, discipline, sacrifice, collective responsibility were essential and timeless, but that McGregor's approach, self-promotion, individual ambition, global thinking, was necessary in a modern world where talent alone isn't enough, where you have to create your own opportunities. The exchange had forced Ireland to confront something it had been avoiding, the tension between traditional values and modern reality, between collective identity and individual ambition, between staying humble and demanding recognition. In the weeks that followed, both men addressed the interview in their own ways. Keane, in his regular punditry slot on Sky Sports, was asked about it and simply said, "We said what needed to be said. I respect him more now than I did before." That was as close to an endorsement as Keane had ever given anyone outside his trusted circle. McGregor posted once on social media a photo of himself and Keane shaking hands after the show with a simple caption, "Real, recognise real." The post received over 10 million likes. But perhaps more significantly, the tone of Irish media coverage of McGregor shifted after that night. The constant criticism, the dismissiveness, the suggestion that he was somehow less legitimate than other Irish sporting heroes began to feed. Not completely, but noticeably, because he had done something that few had been able to do. He had stood up to Roy Keane, the man whose approval seemed to matter more than anyone else's in Irish sport, and he had earned, if not his approval, at least his respect. The exchange also changed how McGregor was perceived internationally. For years, critics had dismissed him as all talk, as someone who manufactured controversies for attention. But that night in Dublin, he had shown something different. He had shown that beneath the bravado, beneath the showmanship, there was substance, there was intelligence, there was a deep understanding of where he came from and what he had overcome. He had articulated his journey in a way that resonated far beyond combat sports, in a way that spoke to anyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told that their way of doing things was wrong. And he had done it while facing down one of the most intimidating figures in Irish sporting history, someone whose respect was notoriously difficult to earn. The Late Late Show appearance became a cultural touchstone in Ireland, referenced in schools, in workplaces, in pubs across the country. It represented something larger than just two famous people disagreeing. It represented a conversation that Ireland needed to have with itself about identity, about success, about what it means to represent your country in a globalised world where the old rules don't always apply.
For Roy Keane, the exchange seemed to offer a kind of closure as well. He had spent 20 years defending his decision to leave Saipan, 20 years being seen as the man who put his principles above his country. McGregor had confronted him directly about it, not to score points, but to make a genuine argument about consistency and fairness. And Keane had listened. He had acknowledged it. He had shown that beneath his tough exterior he was capable of reflection, of growth, of recognizing that others might have valid perspectives even when they contradicted his own. In the months that followed, Keane's punditry became slightly less harsh, slightly more willing to acknowledge different approaches to the game. Not soft, never soft, but more measured, more thoughtful. As if the confrontation with McGregor had reminded him that strength isn't just about never backing down, it's also about knowing when to listen. For McGregor, the moment was validation of a philosophy he had lived by his entire career, that you don't wait for permission, you don't wait for approval, you don't wait for someone to give you a seat at the table. You build your own table. And if someone challenges you, someone with more credibility, more history, more respect, you don't shrink, you stand your ground, you make your case, you prove that you belong not by conforming to their standards, but by showing them that your standards are just as valid. The story of that night in Dublin is more than just a memorable television moment. It's a story about two different versions of Irish masculinity, two different approaches to success, two different ways of carrying the weight of representing a nation. Roy Keane represented the old way, sacrifice without recognition, humility even in greatness, collective success above individual glory. Conor McGregor represented the new way, self-promotion as survival, individual ambition as patriotism, global success as the ultimate validation. And what that night proved was that both ways are legitimate, both ways are valid, both ways are Irish. The tension between them isn't a problem to be solved, it's a dynamic to be understood, a conversation to be continued, a balance to be maintained, because a country needs both. It needs people who will sacrifice for the collective, who will put the team first, who will demand excellence without seeking the spotlight, and it needs people who will refuse to be invisible, who will demand recognition, who will prove that you don't have to come from privilege to achieve greatness. Ireland needs its Roy Keanes, and it needs its Conor McGregors. And that October evening in 2023, it got to see both of them at their most honest, their most vulnerable, their most real. Not agreeing, not compromising, but respecting. And sometimes respect is more valuable than agreement.